My Zoom screen is filling up, but it's paused, and I'm going to assume that's because everybody who's waiting has been admitted. It's so nice, actually. This is the first APPG environmental event that I've chaired, and I was just reflecting actually last night on this APPG, and I think it's probably the only policy area in Parliament that I've worked on where the news has been consistently good since I was elected an MP in December 2019. And that's not because I seek to minimise the extent of the threat to the environment and on climate change, but it's just that sort of policy announcement after policy announcement contains more ambition, more positive news, more government action, more cooperation actually with our international partners. And of course, in the last week, we've seen the very significant commitments that President Biden has made, really transforming the strategy of America. And I was looking at his tweet last night where he committed the US to reaching net zero by 2050 following our lead. And he made express reference in that tweet to protection of the oceans. And one of the things actually, I think, in discussing marine life is it's one of those environmental areas that I think people probably, or the kind of the lay person like me, has the least specialized knowledge of. It's far more easy to sort of understand tree planting or biodiversity or water quality or air quality because you have more kind of day-to-day interaction with those elements. But I think marine life is one of those critical unseens that lots of people who care about the environment care about in principle, but don't really know the extent of the threat. And they don't really know whether or not what we're doing is enough or even the right thing. And so it's incredibly helpful, I think, for everybody who's here today and all of us parliamentarians to hear from our expert speakers about how we can be encouraging the government to go further, or really where they think the government has done the right stuff. And what they think are the big achievements. I mean, we know, for example, that plastic pollution is a massive problem in the oceans. I know the Marine Conservation Society did, it's called the Great Litter Pick. I remember the hashtag on it, but I remember it revealed a hideous amount of waste on British beaches, a lot of it being washed up, drinks cans and so on. And also, we know that intensive fishing is causing huge environmental damage. But then we also know that the Blue Belt programme is responsible for ring fencing, enormous expanses of ocean and protecting the marine life and regulating fishing. And I know I'm very glad that we're concluding with Richard Benyon, who I've got many things to say about, and I'll give him a proper introduction before he speaks, but probably his most important piece of work that's relevant to what we're discussing today is the review that he undertook for the government of the highly protected marine areas very recently, but we'll come back to that. I'm so glad to welcome our first speaker, Chris Tucket from the Marine Conservation Society, on the challenges we face and what she thinks the government can do.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you also for inviting me to this session. I've been at MCS for about 3.5 years. I'm not sure the Environment APPG has ever had a session dedicated to marine. So I think this is the first, certainly in that period. I really welcome it. It's a great signal from our point of view, and so thanks very much for the invite, and to Green Alliance as well. Our marine environment takes up more than 55% of our environment in England. That point that I just said about the APPG and not looking at marine, it means that actually we're not looking at over half the environment that we have in England, and it's more across the UK. The marine environment is hugely significant, and yet it's quite often overlooked. We're heavily reliant on the marine environment, and actually how we manage our land and our rivers heavily impacts on what happens within our seas. So looking at the environment holistically, including the marine environment within that, is hugely important. And that's really probably my overriding message today, that in thinking about what we do with our environment, how we look after it, in this country to really make sure at the front of our minds we're thinking about the marine environment as part of that from the outset. Because I think very often that's not been the case, and it absolutely should be going forward. Marine environment is in a poor state, there's no doubt. The DEFRA report that came out last year on the marine strategy said that 11 out of 15 indicators of health of the marine environment are failing. They're not on green. That's really obviously not very good. Part of the reason is around fishing. We're 94th out of 152 countries for illegal unreported fishing in the UK. Laura mentioned beach litter, marine litter. Yeah, our Great British Beach Clean that we do every year at MCS, we're finding around about 170 pieces of plastic per 100 meters on the beaches that we look at. It's literally a problem that's not going away. And of course, the marine environment, we know very little about it in some cases. It needs to be better monitored and much better understood. By contrast, with that problem around the state of the marine environment, it's also worth an awful lot. We've got WWF on the line here today. They put out a report a couple of weeks ago where they said that recovery of our seas could bring benefits equating to more than 50 billion to the country by 2050. So in economic terms, our marine environment is really important. Put very simply, marine conservation must be more strongly integrated into the UK's plans to address biodiversity loss, but also climate change. And that will also help to support our economy. So where are we now? What's the present situation? Around about 36% of our seas are designated as protected, but actually only around 5% of those have got proper management measures in place, which means that those damaging activities that are supposed to be stopped by having those protected areas, those damaging activities can still go on. We've got a new Fisheries Act that's come in. It's good. It's got good potential, I would say. The Fisheries Minister has said that this is a framework act. There's a lot of work to do to make that act a reality, and the objectives around sustainability that are in it actually bring them to the fore and bring them through. As Laura mentioned, UK on the international stage is very important for marine. We've launched the Global Ocean Alliance to support the target to protect 30% of global seas by 2030. That's great international ambition, but we need to make sure we bring it home and we do it in the UK as well. So there are, I think, several practical solutions. DEFRA have named this the Marine Super Year. 2021 is the Marine Super Year, which is great. We really welcome that. It's the year, of course, when we're hosting COP26, the G7. This brings a lot of potential this year. And that's good because this is urgent. We can't wait. You all know the environmental crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis are urgent. And it's urgent for the sea as well, the marine environment, but we've got things that we can do this year. Environment Bill, yes, we heard yesterday that's on pause. That's regrettable. Of course it is, but we understand the reasons. At the moment, the Environment Bill doesn't heavily include marine. Fair to say, we've been told that, you know, it's in there, but I think it could be brought through much more strongly within the Environment Bill. Also within that bill, there are things around deposit return schemes for containers. Really, that's an initiative that's been sitting around for a long time. A lot of other countries have brought it in, and we should try and get on with DRS as soon as we can, because that will have an impact on all those bottles that we're seeing at the sea. Marine protected areas, I said 30%, 36% are classified as protected. But we need to put those measures in place to make them properly looked after. We do need to look at things like bottom trawling of the seabed, because that's something that's hugely damaging, and we need to try and prevent that sort of damage. And the Fisheries Act, There are things that we can start introducing now, like remote electronic monitoring on fishing boats, which is a real practical measure that will help to get the management in place and do it well and create a level playing field for everybody who's out fishing and have much better evidence about what's happening. And finally, blue carbon. That's the kind of new kid on the block here. The role of the marine environment in sequestering carbon. So we're talking about salt marsh, seagrass, kelp, and deep sea or sea shelf sediments. These can capture huge amounts of carbon. We think at NCS that they should be part of the range of nature-based solutions. So yes, obviously, planting trees, looking after peat bogs, that kind of thing is really important, but also start to think about looking after those marine environments, doing that marine protection, because it will prevent carbon being released, but also help to sequester carbon when we do it right. We would really like to see a blue carbon strategy that's brought in that makes marine nature-based solutions for carbon an integral part of our commitments within our nationally determined contribution, within our net zero commitments. It's got to be done right, the science has to be behind it, but we think there is massive potential there, and potentially there's massive funding that could go with it. We've estimated that if we stopped disturbance of offshore sediments, if we kept doing what we're doing, it's going to cost us 9 billion to mitigate over 25 years. But if you flip that around and think about looking after those habitats, it could save us a huge amount of money. So COP26, also G7 in June, down in Cornwall by the coast, huge opportunities to take some of these initiatives forward. For nature, people and the economy, we've got to do those things together. Absolutely welcome your support and parliamentary support on this. We're here at MCS and very happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much. That was just really illuminating talk and quite a lot of ideas in there that I'd never really heard about before, which I think reveals actually how little is known, even by MPs who are very interested in the environment, about the way that the sort of marine environment could be used to further our objectives. So I'm sure there'll be questions coming back to you. Our second speaker is Dale Rodmell, who is the Assistant Chief Executive of the National Federation of Fishermen. And I'd imagine quite a lot of what he's going to say will dovetail with what Chris just talked about in terms of the environmental effects of fishing. Dale, over to you.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak and provide a fisheries perspective today. I've been in post 12 years, so really from the beginning of the policy to extend marine protected areas through marine conservation zones. So I'll start by saying something just about that first. I have some slides, so I'll get them onto the screen. Can everyone see those? Okay, hopefully they're coming through. I'm not sure whether you can see my page or my notes page actually. But anyway, as long as it's on the screen. So I mean, it's worth noting that our current network, we are actually a world leader in terms of the scale of marine protected areas that have been designated within the UK and its territories, and that's substantial. Of course, we're now into the process of implementing management measures, and we've had criticisms of paper parks about that, but we've got to go through the process of doing that, of course, and our MPAs are predicated on the idea that sustainable activities are allowed. So that means a process has to occur, an evidence-based process has to determine which activities are compatible, and indeed the extent to which they're compatible with the conservation objectives of the sites concerned. And certainly, as far as fisheries are concerned, the last decade has we've developed methods and scientific processes to give a better evidence base and best available evidence base in order to inform what those measures need to be. And it's important that we've done that work's being done, because it's also important to deliver management that is fair and accommodates sustainable livelihoods where they are sustainable with the marine protected areas concerned, and also to avoid unintended consequences of displacing activities where they don't necessarily need to be displaced, which have socioeconomic implications for coastal communities, as well as knock-on environmental implications as well. So I think in terms of this phase of where we are, it's about having the right management resources in place to deliver management. We've got a huge network, of course, 371 sites in the UK, nearly 200 in English waters. So there's a question there about having the right manager capacity to do the necessary assessments on the one hand, and in a timely way, but also to have allow participation of marine users as far as that's can be achieved through adaptive management approaches. And this is, so it's not all a bureaucratic exercise, it's about bringing people into the management of sites and having durable management and MPAs that communities can buy into. And we did work with JNCC and the MMO, Natural England, on this. I'll give you the link there below. But we also have to look at MPAs in terms of the bigger picture and our longer term ambitions. And certainly the idea that we can deliver 30% of our seas as highly protected marine areas, I just really don't think is realistic in our busy and increasingly busy marine waters. And just looking at what we need to deliver elsewhere in terms of climate ambitions, the renewable energy targets. If you look at the top right map there, the dark blue areas, they exist in constructed wind farms. They amount to around 10.5 gigawatts. Now we've got an ambition, if we're going to meet the Committee on Climate Change ambitions for net zero, we need 125 gigawatts. So we're basically expanding those areas. And this is back of the fact packet, but we're looking at a 10 to 12 increase in those areas. So I think the idea we can have marine conservation, everything separately, is really not realistic at all. We need to actually know how much space is needed for these things. We don't have a proper handle on it yet. I say, you know, my comment there is back of the fact packet, but this hasn't been worked out. Can conservation coexist with wind farms, and under what circumstances? We need to do the strategic work to understand that and whether that's possible. And from a fishing perspective, looking at it from the other end of the telescope and the loss of customary grounds, we need to be looking at how much space does fisheries need to sustainably produce the resource and indeed the space required to support our fishing communities. These questions haven't been answered, and I think although we've now got marine plans, well, we've got draft plans for much of England still, but hopefully to be signed off soon. Our marine planning processes are still very fragmented and passive. If you compare it with Scotland, even, they're far more far more advanced, I think, in terms of offshore wind and then integrating it into their planning process, which we're not at the moment in English waters. And then just focusing on fisheries directly, well, in terms of dealing with conservation issues, generally speaking, the best approach in dealing with our sector is to deal with it directly. The two key areas really under the main strategy related to bycatch management and dealing with seabed integrity targets, which MPAs will help contribute to. But what else is needed is that government facilitate the science, the innovation, our industry, and indeed NGOs to work on these things constructively and in partnership. And I think DEFRA's taken a lead on this with respect to non-target species bycatch management with a newly branded initiative, but it's bringing together of a few other initiatives that have been going on for a bit longer. That's the Clean Catch UK initiative, and that's the intention there is that you pilot work locally with individual fisheries, working with the industry concerned. You learn and adapt what works, and then you look at rolling out or seeing how that's more relevant to the wider fisheries in terms of mainstreaming. So I think that's the way forward in other areas through environmental management. But more broadly, if we look at the Fisheries Act and becoming an independent coastal state for managing our fisheries, I think that also gives us an opportunity to be much more focused on co-management approaches to delivering good policy. And that means we move away from being less top-down, remote, second-guessing regulations that often don't function appropriately on the ground. We move more to creating a frame that's incentive-based, delegates greater responsibility to the industry to deliver on environmental outcomes. And that's instead of tight regulation, that's about allowing the industry to become more involved in demonstrating how it's managed, how its operations and impacts will deliver on the outcomes, a kind of auditing-based approach, if you like, something that's referred to in the academic literature as results-based management. But technologies are increasingly allowing us to do that. And also, I think, given what we have with delivering fisheries management and the new fisheries management plans, arrangements under the Fisheries Act is hopefully my slides have gone now. Does that come through to you, Laura?
I think we've lost your slides, Dale.
Well, sorry, that was my last slide. I'm not sure whether I disappeared at the
Did disappear for a moment. So perhaps I want to repeat your last couple of sentences just to wrap up, because we sort of lost you and then that was the end.
Oh, right, I see. Well, I was I'm just saying that under the Fisheries Act that we have an opportunity with the fisheries management plans to deliver that kind of co-management approach, which was much more difficult to deliver, I think, under the Common Fisheries Policy because of the way it worked effectively. So it's an opportunity, I think, moving forward for us.
Dale, thank you so much. That was really, really illuminating talk. And now, finally, we turn to the newly ennobled Richard Benyon, who is also my predecessor as the MP for Newbury. And many of you, I think, will probably know Richard anyway. He was the MP for Newbury for 15 years. He was also the Minister for Fisheries at DEFRA for 3.5 years under David Cameron. He's just become a peer. He is an absolute guru on all matters marine and is probably the Member of Parliament in the last 2 decades who has done the most work on this issue. So I know one of Richard's kind of big characteristics is that he's always optimistic, but I would be really grateful, Richard, if you could help us with where you think we can take heart and also where you think we should be focusing our efforts in this APPG to push the government to go further.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for your kind words. There are a lot more experienced people than me on marine matters, not least our last 2 speakers. But it's a great pleasure to be back in the All-Party Environment Group, so ably chaired by Anthony, and great that it's still a force in Parliament, and I look forward to attending many more sessions in the future. Chris started by talking about the commitment that the government has signed up to protect 30% of our oceans by 2030, and on the face of it, we're doing pretty well. But I do think we need to be clear about what we're talking about in terms of spatial protection measures. we have a large amount of partially protected areas. These are, in many cases, as Dale said, the product of the Marine and Coastal Access Act, which I inherited sort of a year after it hit the, after it received royal assent, and had to implement the rollout of marine conservation zones to complement an existing suite of other protections, marine protected areas, European designations, Ramsar sites, sites of special scientific interest, and others. What's been lacking in our UK waters has been highly protected marine areas. There are a couple of small postage stamp size protections which have delivered enormous benefits in the immediate vicinity of where they're located. And Michael Gove asked me to share a review, which we did, and we reported on World Oceans Day last June on highly protected marine areas and the value of those for the protection of our oceans. The evidence that we saw as part of that review, and I had a very mixed panel of conservationists, sea users, wind farmers, fishermen, and others, and it produced, we saw some really interesting evidence. And there have been two more recent research papers which have backed up what we saw as part of that review. And they show that partial protection don't really contribute much to biodiversity and the biome conservation. Globally, 69% of MPAs are only partially protected. And as Jean-Luc has just put up on the chat there, that only 5% of our protected areas have bottom-towed gear banning from those waters. So the point is, what is the value of these partially protected marine areas? Now, in some areas, it's very high because there are good management plans in place. There are maybe reefs and other things that fishermen don't want to go to anyway, and they are effective. But by and large, many of our partially protected marine areas are almost, forgive the pun, red herrings, because they create an illusion of protection. And they divert resources away for a little or no environmental gain. And that is what the value of highly protected marine areas, because they have an enormous uplift in benefit. And you see, we saw, for example, in California, where the greatest advocates of highly protected marine areas are actually the fishing industry, because in the areas around those protected areas, they have a massive increase in biomass, which they are able to sustainably exploit. In the few minutes I've got, I'm going to race through various points. Chris mentioned blue carbon, and she's absolutely right to do so. You've seen some stats that some people have been putting up on the chat there about the value of seagrass and other environments. But I'm just off the east coast of England, off the Thames estuary, and there's some pretty dull-looking sedimentary mud. If you were to go down there and look at it, it is actually has 7 times the carbon sequestration value of upland peat. And every time you drag a bottom-towed fishing gear over it, that reduces. And there's increasing evidence about this. So we have to recognize the value of all these environments. A fully protected marine area has a huge increase in biodiversity. It also has benefits in terms of, as been shown around the world, of tourism, of community, a sense of community good. And these new research projects, particularly in Australia, have been fascinating. What my panel recommended was that highly protected marine areas should be located within existing marine protected areas. There are several reasons for this. First of all, there is already a wealth of scientific evidence to support these as important environments. And really, we don't have the time, and we don't have the luxury of indulging in expensive and lengthy new scientific trawls for new data, particularly when we have so much information as a result of a previous allocation of these sites. Secondly, we need to have better community and stakeholder engagement. In 2010, when we started on this process, There was an element of the marine conservation zones called reference areas, which were effectively highly protected marine areas, and they were a disaster because we didn't consult people properly and they weren't implemented in the right way. And civil servants are quite rightly wanting always to protect ministers from legal challenges, but we don't need to worry about legal challenges where there is already a good lot of evidence. So my advice to you, the APPG, and to parliamentary colleagues, old and I can see some of my new colleagues there, is that keep the government's feet to the fire. They have this report. I hope they implement the recommendations. I hope they look in the back and see that there is a choice of sites from which they can develop pilot sites, and they can get on with it because we don't have the luxury of time. But also they can pat themselves on the back a bit because globally, as has been said, there's quite a good news story. 4.2 million square kilometers of UK waters are protected. Give you a view on that. India is 3.2 square kilometers. So over 1 billion more square kilometers than the size of India of British waters is protected under our Blue Belt policy. And many of those are highly protected marine areas. So take, for example, around Tristan da Cunha, which is 200,000 square kilometers, just been announced. There will be some artisanal fishing by the Tristan da Cunha community, but all the big trawlers will be taken out of those waters. And we also developed a system of policing it, which is a state-of-the-art, UK developed satellite technology, and I've seen it and it's amazing. I'll just finish by returning to UK waters to talk about one example where huge work needs to be done. When I was the minister, I signed off a European designation for the Dogger Bank. And this is an extraordinary environment and used to be a favored haunt of sturgeon, of angel sharks, and it's been overfished. And it has been overfished principally not by British fishermen. Nearly all the people fishing on the Dogger Bank, a marine protected area, bottom trawling away, are continental boats, and the vast majority of the fish they catch, they land on the continent and not in UK ports. We have an extraordinary ability now to be able to just, at the stroke of a pen, protect areas like the Dogger Bank, as we should have done when I signed that off nearly a decade ago. And so these areas are still being fished by damaging measures and not to the advantage of UK fishermen. And that's why you find organizations like the Renaissance of East Anglian Fisheries. These are fishermen in East Anglia who see the value of marine protected areas, and more than that, they see the value of highly protected marine areas because they know the benefits it brings to the fish that they want to exploit. And so there are many other cases. There's a marine protected area for the northwest of Scotland, which is, until I hope a new decree has been signed that will stop the kind of fishing that's been going on there. But there are many other areas which are lines on maps and aren't effective. And it's simply no good, whether we're in Britain or whether we're around the world. And when I was a minister, I went to the Pacific Islands Forum and heard all these wonderful Pacific Island states standing up saying they were allocating huge areas of seas, and you just knew they weren't. And I don't want Britain to go down that route. We're doing a really good job on our overseas territories. We started to do a good job in UK waters. Now's the opportunity to grasp this, not just because we want to protect the future lives of fishermen by having a biomass of fish that is ever rising, but also because of the blue carbon benefits in this, the year of COP26.
Thank you so much, Richard, and all of you. And I think the two big takeaways I've got from your three presentations is firstly that we need to be holding the government's feet to the fire on the protection or the creation of highly protected marine areas, and also that we need to be properly exploiting the opportunities for carbon capture in the marine environment. And I'm sure there's more, but I think I've got those sort of flashing red on the dashboard that have come out of your presentations. Now, I'm just going to quickly look through the chat and pick up some questions that I saw coming through. The first one is from Gareth Cunningham from the RSPB, excuse me, he says, the UK government has committed to 30% of UK seas to be within protected areas, with highly protected areas, but as recent government, okay, so his question is, what can we expect from the UK government in 2021? So Richard, you may be best poised to answer this as to where you think the government is likely to go. Do you think we're going to see more movement towards highly protected areas, or do you think DEFRA needs a bit of a shove?
My report was submitted in June, and normally you give governments a bit of time over recess and a bit of a slug into the next session to produce a response. But I'm the first to say, look, you know, as you got towards the end of last year, there was Brexit, there was COVID, there was all sorts of other demands, and I know that the civil service team that were brilliant, that supported my that supported my review, were sent off to do other things. They are now back at their desks, and hopefully the government will publish soon its response to our review. And what I hope the government will say is that obviously they will accept the recommendations. The Treasury curtailed us by saying they would only support 5 pilot sites. Actually, I mean, I think that's the bare minimum. I think the government should go ahead and pilot 3 inshore sites, 2 offshore sites, and in that mix there should be some blue carbon wins as well. And they should do that not just in one part of the seas, but around the English coast. So something in the Irish Sea, something in the North Sea, something in the Channel or off the southwest, and really drill down and see how you can make it easier, and then very quickly move on to make sure other areas. And at the same time as that, they must be making sure that there are robust management plans in for the remainder of the marine protected areas, so that in certain areas we don't see a continuation of what happened before they were designated, which is still activities taking place in them that are untenable in the definition of a marine protected area. The final thing I would say is co-location, I think, is a huge benefit. I think in and around those wind farms, there is the potential to see huge benefits for biodiversity, and we haven't even begun and don't have time today to talk about it. But I think that sort of co-location concept is something that Dale's members can be happy with. It's something that Chris's members can be happy with, and it's something that can be pushed forward, but not as an alternative to HPMAs, but alongside them.
Thank you. The next question I'm going to take it in this sequence, actually, Richard, Benwell, and then Sherilyn. So Richard, his question was, we're asking more and more of the oceans. He refers to something I think the Prime Minister said in a speech in the autumn, turning us into the Saudi Arabia of wind power, blue carbon, environmental recovery, leisure, industry, fisheries. He says, how can the system be reformed, and how can we, I suppose, make an assessment of the marine protection demands before the next round of offshore wind developments? And I think this touches on some of the themes that were talked about. Chris, do you want to take that question? Is it clear? I think it's basically, how can we make sure that we're putting marine protection before we get stuck into a whole load of new offshore wind farms?
I think my answer to that sort of answers this, but it also alludes back to what Sir Richard was saying, that it's the policy for this lies with DEFRA, but actually I think we need to look across government and make sure that other government departments have got this as well, because you mentioned Treasury, BEIS, when we're talking about carbon, COP26, whatever it may be. I think this is a cross-government issue that needs to be raised up. And when we're talking about wind power, energy, renewables, all of that, obviously it's other departments that need to play into this. So we have a marine planning system. It's not worked brilliantly up to now. DEFRA are talking about reform of that marine planning system so that we do look properly at what we plan to put where. Fisheries, I think, should absolutely be part of those plans. It's not at the moment. So everything that we plan to use our seas for should be taken into account and figured out here, and the impacts thought about, so that the detriment to the environment is minimized and we can still allow ocean recovery. I mean, no doubt that's a difficult challenge. Of course, it's a difficult challenge, but we must monitor properly and have that information in place and plan strategically for our seas going forward. And as I say, that's definitely not something that can just sit with DEFRA. That whole thing of making it government-wide, bringing in Treasury and other departments, I think is vitally important.
Do you think there are other countries that provide a model of good marine planning that we could sort of emulate?
Interestingly, Wales, I think, have got a better marine plan. It's countrywide for a start. You know, sea knows no boundaries. We need a UK-wide and beyond. So Wales have got a good marine plan, but honestly, they struggle a bit on actually delivering it. So I think the theory is there, and we could possibly look to some of that. Other countries, others might want to come in on that if you've got better ideas. I think it's difficult, but they have different challenges. You know, you look at the North Sea, the amount of use that there is at the North Sea. We're not unique, but it's pretty extreme where we are.
Yeah. Dale or Richard, would you like to come in on that question?
Sorry, Laura, the question, could you repeat it again?
The question was about planning properly. So before we launch into the next round of offshore wind farms, how do we ensure that we're not basically placing too many demands on the ocean before we've got in, we've sort of figured out our strategy on marine protection?
I don't think it's that difficult to work out. It just needs actual a strategic planning process to occur, which we really haven't got at the moment. Outside of, well, we haven't as a whole got it at the UK, but if you look at what the Scotland have done with their next round of offshore wind planning, they have tried to tie, they've got a sector plan now which ties in with their overarching marine plan. South of the border, we've got round 4 wind farm planning, which is a leasing, essentially a leasing process under the Crown Estate. It's a watered down planning system. It's not, we're not deep, we're not looking at the issues in any comprehensive way. And that's what's needed. The basic maths done on what's needed and where do we find synergies? Where do we need to make the trade-offs? We've not started.
I think that the marine planning system hasn't really worked in English waters. Part of the Marine Coastal Access Act was a requirement that we introduce marine plans, and we started, and they weren't very good. But those, my mistake was as an MP for a constituency, Laura, that is about as far from the sea as you could get, is that a marine plan would be rather like a local authorities plan. You would zone areas. You'd say this is an area that we would be predetermined to allow housing in. This is an area for beauty and conservation, and to me, that it's perfectly simple that you zone the sea. But of course, what we actually did was to go in at the lowest possible level, and it came down to nothing. And I think that there is a job to do in proper marine planning. You ask which other countries. I mean, there are loads of countries that are doing good work in conservation and fisheries management. I think some of the most interesting work, funnily enough, is the United States. And you find all sorts of different parts in the United States, some doing it very well, some doing it appallingly. But particularly on inshore fisheries. And as I say, in getting fishermen on the side of spatial, highly protected marine areas, that was an extraordinary education for me to see what was happening in California and how the fishermen were the greatest advocates for HPMAs there. I thought it was really interesting.
Thank you. I'm going to ask my colleague Sherilyn McCrory to ask the next question.
Thanks, Laura. It follows on quite nicely, actually, about bringing the fishing community into the conversation early and making sure that that they are advocates for this. And I'm going to take it one step further. I'm going to declare an interest. My husband's a hook and line fisherman, and he's just been extremely disappointed in the amount of fish that he took to market last week. I mean, boxes and boxes of it that he took over in a number of days, and he's barely made anything. And there's lots of reasons for that at the moment. But the point I wanted to make was that he was told by the market that the big producers would kind of look at these little boxes and realize that nobody wanted them, and then just take them on with all of the stuff that had been netted and probably sitting there for days and was going off for dog food. There is a huge issue, I think, in our fisheries and our fisheries industry, that, you know, the middlemen are making a huge amount of money on this, and the consumer isn't at the moment knowledgeable enough to do anything about it. So we're in strange times. So I understand this, but I think what we need to be doing, I think what the point I'm trying to get to in relation to our APPG today is that we need to be making this industry an awfully lot more transparent, as we have with the rest of the farming industry, as to where your food is coming from and what's on your plate. And then we need to absolutely be incentivizing not just the small hook and liners like my husband, but also the bigger boats to be fishing sustainably, so not using the bottom draggers. Incentivize them to do something differently so that they're doing less damage to the seabed at a time. But unless you do the carrot, it's not going to happen. And that either happens with their fish price, or it happens by incentivizing them to change their equipment. So I've got quite a big task with me in front of me when I talk to DEFRA, but it is something that we have to do. I mean, the fishing industry has had up until now a common enemy, which was the EU. Now that enemy has disappeared, or will do in 5.5 years. They now are going to be clashing with each other, and government has a really important role to play, as does the consumer, as to how we manage that. And until we get that right, we're going to have a battle on our hands locally, trying to get them involved with that conservation conversation.
Can I have a response to that, Sherilyn? I am a board member of the Blue Marine Foundation, and I would advocate anyone who's interested in this to look at a short film that they've got on their website about what they've done at Lyme Bay. And this is a system that improves conservation and improves the value of the species harvested from that extraordinary environment, and has enriched the fishermen, and they are now working hand in glove with supermarkets to get at a higher price. It's absolutely fantastic. The final thing I'd say on this is that I'm always very suspicious about the supply chains that have developed basically since the Cod War. I can remember being given fish and chips by a group of fishermen. I can't remember what port it was in. I visited so many. And I said, this is delicious. I was scoffing away. And they said, almost certainly came from Iceland. And that we've developed these supply chains where I was trying to get, you know, the industry to go and look at more sustainable stocks, for example, that were being of cod that were being caught in the Barents Sea by the Norwegians. You know, I said that is much more sustainable. They're catching 1 million tons of sustainable cod, I think it was. I think I'm right. And there was no way our British consumer was going to have access to that, because we were locked into a supply chain that too few people knew about and too few people could influence. So your point about transparency is absolutely right.
And could I also add, I think the consumer end of this is really important as well. We do something called the Good Fish Guide. We're in the throes of updating that, just completely redoing it at the moment. That's going to be out in April. That is about letting consumers know what fish is sustainable, where it comes from, and providing that information, providing that drive to buy sustainable fish. We're also working with supermarkets and the supply chain on that. So I think creating the pool, because our taste in fish and what we have in this country is so limited and there is so much available. We've heard that time after time, but we are trying to do some work to open that up, to help people to get hold of sustainable fish, to know what good stuff is to buy. And we do work with the fishing industry, but absolutely for us to work with the sustainable side of the fishing industry, the guys that are doing the right stuff, and help them for the consumers to buy their goods would be fantastic.
I could just follow Chris there, and looking at the big picture and the way the market's changed over the last few decades. Obviously, we had the advent of the supermarkets in the 1980s, and we've seen obviously the supply chains have changed very much from you would have once gone to your fishmonger, now you go to your supermarket, of course. supermarkets' buying power and so forth have become very much more fixed on larger scale supply chains, which are predominantly import supply trade. So we've seen a change in consumption patterns from supermarkets because of that. I thought what was interesting was if anybody who's been watching this Fishing Life, this last week was highlighting what happened at the beginning of the first lockdown of the last year, and a lot of small fishing businesses decided that they would try to set up direct sales businesses, and it just showed like how successful some of them were being. It's a corner of the marketplace, but it's something to build upon. And I do think we need to do a lot more to highlight the provenance of our fish from our own waters and start replacing some of that imported fish with our domestically caught fish, and get away from the dependency of 80% of our 80% of our fish is currently being exported.
Can I just come? Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, we'll just come back to your other point on spatial conflict. Yes, I mean, there is spatial conflict for different fisheries at the local level, but I think it's worth pointing out that, as at least my understanding of highly protected marine areas, there would be no fishing in these. This is where one of the big difficulties lies, because it doesn't take very long to have the area, depending on the location, to have an area which starts to have very large impacts on fishing communities, especially in coastal waters. Now, that's not to say that we're not going to have places where there's very little activity going on, but that there may be more benign forms of fishing going on with our existing MPAs. Once all the management's been introduced, I mean, there's not going to be any trawling within seagrass beds, for example. We know that. Any of these sensitive, vulnerable habitats are going to have appropriate evidence-based management measures put in place. And the idea that these are not going to deliver something useful and this kind of some sort of second-rate MPA compared to the nirvana of a highly protected marine area I don't think stands up to a full scrutiny if you're looking at the scale of the network that we already have once we've delivered on that management. And as I mentioned in my presentation, I think there's a lot more that we can do in the fishing industry directly. I think if we've been looking at seabed impact 10, 15 years ago, looking at the approach that we've started now with bycatch, working with industry, applying technology and innovation, and seeing where the industry can be incentivized to reduce its impact directly, then I think we could have actually made quite a lot of progress by now already.
If I can just come back very quickly, I agree with all of that. I think I'm going to leave you with one thought, that one of the things I found out earlier this month when we were having the issues at the border was that pilchard, which is caught in Cornwall and marketed as Cornish sardines, is landed in the UK, sent to, lorried over to France, canned and sold back to British supermarkets. I'll leave it there.
I can go one stage further. Some nephrops that are caught in the North Sea are frozen and sent to Vietnam to be peeled and then sent back to the UK. So I see your food miles and I raise you mine.
Wow, well, I think we have time for one last question, and I think I'm going to just absorb a few sort of themes in, really. It starts with what Jerome has raised, but I think other people have come in and commented similarly. And basically the question is, if we dispense with the bottom trawl methods of fishing, are there existing methods which are either adequate substitutes or are there sort of innovative ideas we should be exploring as substitutes? And I've seen other people have commented with various forms. And so any sort of thoughts you could give? I mean, Dale, it seems like a natural question for you to answer first of all, on alternative and sustainable fishing methods.
There's going to be a place for incentivizing more benign forms of fishing, but I think you've got to look at this in the detail. in some cases, it's about applying technical measures, whether it's mesh sizes, whether it's, for instance, with porpoise, we've had pingers on nets, for example. There may be relatively simple solutions that can be applied to existing forms of fishing, that they need to be explored depending on the issue we're looking at. That's not to rule out. There may be, in some cases, it may make more sense that a different form of fishing applies, but it's about having the full menu, I think, to be looking at. We also need to bear in mind, you may induce change from one form of fishing to another, but they have their own environmental implications. So, for instance, I've had it suggested to me that we should reduce the amount of netters, and all these netters should all turn over to longlining, for example. But okay, that might be one way of dealing with cetaceans, but then you've got seabirds. So then, seabirds may be an issue with longline, although there's mitigation we can apply there too. But the point I'm making is it's not simple. It's very fishery specific how you need to look at the issues.
Thanks, Dale. Chris.
Yeah, Dale's right. Of course, he's right. He's the expert on this stuff. But I think Cherilyn mentioned farming. I used to work on agriculture, and I think there are quite a lot of parallels between farming and fishing. Farming industry, I know, has had to innovate. They have innovated a lot, particularly in recent years, precision farming and all those sorts of things. I think there's been less from what I've seen within the fishing industry. The types of gear that are used, they've been around for a long, long time. Obviously, with everything, it needs investment. But I think that investment in innovation, innovative techniques for fishing, yes, the sorts of things that we've got in the chat there about pot line, the right thing in the right place, but also much more innovation around how we best catch fish. And as I said earlier, much more knowledge about what the impacts might be are really needed. That's a bit of a half answer, I know, but I don't think we've really tried to do this differently. And with some investment, maybe we could.
Thank you, Chris. Richard, I don't know if you have to go. You've got a 3 o'clock.
I've got to meet Black Rod at 3 o'clock. So I better not be late for that. I just want to say I entirely agree. I think there are I think a lot has been done in the fishing industry, and they deserve to be that it deserves to be recognised. For example, allowing CCTVs on vessels, and the cod recovery project's been an enormous success, and that's really down to them. And there's a place for everything, but innovation shouldn't. Should be driven by, I think the consumer is increasingly driving innovation, and wanting to see the blue tick on the product they're buying, driving their retailers to ever higher standards of sustainability. And what we mean by minimum sustainable yield and maximum sustainable yield, sorry, and what we mean by protection measures and what we mean by sustainability is going to become more and more important. Fishermen understand that, the processors understand it, government understands, but you've got to get on with it. Sorry, got to go. Thank you.
Well, bye, Richard. Thank you so much for that. It was, and to all of our speakers, that was, Richard, feel free if you have to jump off, but that was a really, really fascinating, really instructive lesson, actually, in what I think we need to do. And I think it gives us some really clear signposts as parliamentarians. If there's anything that kind of occurs to you, any of the speakers or any of the guests in follow-up, then do please feel free to either email me or Anthony Brown to our parliamentary email addresses, because we'll be putting something together to send up to DEFRA afterwards. But I think I found that very, very instructive, and I'm very grateful to you for your time this afternoon. So thank you to all the parliamentarians and to our speakers. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.